Hello my sea otters, Seabro here, and today I just want to recap what we have talked about thus far. This isn't a replacement for previous videos, but hopefully it can be used to remind yourself at a later date of concepts I have talked about and will reinforce what I've talked about in your good old noggin. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the video. Get your big hat on and in position because we are going to do some big brain thinking today and covering everything really quickly, so prepare yourself. Okay, so 3 compositions: spam, brawl and dive. Spam uses long sightlines to control map space and love playing in the open areas where they can create cross angles and spam down the enemy. They have the option of playing for shield break and just bursting down the enemy shields and then the tanks behind it, or they can create such amazingly aggressive angles that nobody is safe. Spam heroes include, but are not limited to, Orisa, Sigma, Ashe, Echo, Pharah, Junkrat, Bastion, Zen, Baptiste and a lot of others. Moving on to Brawl, they love playing around corners and chokes. Unlike Spam, they have next to no map control and instead they want the fight to take place around them. They want to either set up somewhere that the enemy has to engage them, or they want to speed on them and close the distance as quickly as possible. Hence why Lucio is normally picked. Brawl heroes include Reinhardt, Zarya, Mei, Reaper, Symmetra, Lucio, Moira and others. And lastly, let's talk about Dive. Dive is a mobile composition that plays like a pack of hyenas. They grab their high ground, surround the enemies and then they pounce. There are 3 types of dive that you can do. You have soft dives to gain space, hard dives to kill, and counter dives to pill. When hard diving, you should follow 3 key steps. You should scout, stage, and then dive. Basically, you want to figure out where the enemy is and how you want to dive, set up where you need to, taking high ground, and then pounce on the enemy all at the same time. With any dive composition, timing is always key. You want your team to deal all of their damage to the enemy at the same time. Dive heroes include Winston, D.Va, Tracer, Genji, Sombra, Zenyatta, Ana, and others. And if you combine any of these compositions, you get what we call a hybrid composition. This just means that the comp has multiple playstyles that they can use. In general, and it's a bit of a generalization, but spam beats brawl, brawl beats dive, and dive beats spam. But hybrid compositions make it less weak to other compositions. Covers up all of your weaknesses, or at least some of them, but also gives you a lot of flexibility on how you want to play. For example, if you are playing a brawl spam hybrid composition, then you are less strong at either playstyle, but you can choose to play a more brawly playstyle against dive and a more spam based playstyle against spam or brawl. Hopefully that makes sense. So again, we're going through these quite quickly. Feel free to pause the video to catch your breath, and in that time you can subscribe. Anyways, moving on. Now let's talk about the matchups of these 3 compositions. In the 3 previous videos in this series, I talked about this graph. It shows where different teams are effective. Brawl is really powerful early on, but slowly gets less effective the more the fight drags on. Spam stays really consistent, and Brawl have this massive power spike in the middle, which makes the graph look really messy. But when the dive composition continues the fight past this power spike, then they're no longer in luck. They're doomed to fail. All non-mirror matchups highly depend on this graph, so keep it in your brain. Now let's look at these matchups. I'll only go through them briefly. If you want a longer explanation, then you'll need to have watched the previous 3 videos in this series. But anyways, our first matchup is Spam versus Spam. This matchup is all about map control. The defending team starts off with all of the map control, and the attacking team starts off with no map control. The attacking team needs to deal with each split and try to gain that map control for themselves. They can do this by pushing with an advantage in order to overwhelm that split and take that map control, or they can neutralize an angle by mirroring splits. Both compositions want to have this concave structure to their team, so pushing flank lanes is important to gain optimal map control. And once you have this concave structure, then you're in a good position to force a fight. Link to a video explaining this further is in the top right, but also in the description. Next we have Spam versus Dive. Here Spam want to stop Dive from setting up, and finish the fight before the dive composition can actually dive. If the enemy is in dive range, you want to force that dive to happen onto your tanks, not your backline. That's why it can be so difficult to attack with a spam composition, because you don't have the luxury of setting up your backline. But yeah, you want any squishies with little or no mobility to be completely dive proof. It's for this reason it's important that your tanks take aggressive angles and your squishies take passive angles. But obviously you still want the healers to be in LOS of your tanks. As diver, you want to be taking angles and minimizing the spam that you take before your dive. These angles need to effectively engage the same group if possible. If too many of your splits are engaged on separate tasks like mirroring splits or they get forced out early, then you won't have the explosiveness that you need to burst down the enemy tanks. Exploding on the enemy is a full team effort, and as always, timing is key. Spam versus Brawl. For Spam, it's all about keeping the distance, and for Brawl, it's all about closing the distance. Often, if a Brawl composition is playing or pathing through an open area, Spam compositions can just melt down the enemy shields and win the shield war. You also want to be taking angles so that you can pressure the enemy backline mid-rotation and hopefully get a pick. If you're running an Orisa, Holt is always useful for this. Another thing, if Spam compositions are forced to Brawl, then you want it to be your Orisa if you have one, or main tank that contests the enemy, and you want to avoid pushing through chokes. In order for Brawl to approach a Spam composition, often you want to be using flankers to divert the enemy attention. This can be a Reaper, Tracer, Sombra, anything that can divert the enemy's attention will allow the core of your team to push towards the Spam composition. Situationally, you can also force point. This will force somebody on the enemy team to try and contest, and then you can run them down. But often point is in the open, right, which leads to you being spammed out. It's really map dependent, and it depends on where the enemy team's set up as well. Now let's talk about Brawl versus Brawl. This matchup is all about chokes and corners. To get through a choke, you often need to invest ultimates or bypass it by out-rotating the enemy. When fighting in the open, or anywhere, to be honest, you want to be bypassing enemy shields. Neither team want to be playing for shield break, because spoilers, you don't have any. Brawl versus Dive. In this matchup, Brawl want to deny the high ground and try to survive the dive. Setting up somewhere undivable or in a closed area is often a good counter to a dive engagement. Brawl want to be rotating through closed areas and places with lots of cover, and Dive want to be punishing Brawl mid-rotation. Dive are really good at jumping the enemy while they're moving, but if they're set up in a strong situation with a corner or a choke, then they've got the protection that can really help against Dive, so you want to be diving them mid-rotation if possible. Dive also has the option of forcing point, which will force the Brawl composition into an open area, because point is usually open, on most maps. But often because Brawl has a lot of sustain, you should consider using ultimates as Dive when attacking Brawl, because you need that explosiveness. Most of the time you can also set up on the high ground for absolutely free. There's no reason not to set up perfectly in the staging phase, unless I guess you're running out of time. But generally, Brawl won't restrict you on taking space. You can set up wherever. Once you have engaged though, you often want to back out. If the fight goes on for too long, then you are at a disadvantage when playing with Dive. You can only really follow up on the rest of the team without resetting and going in again if you have gotten multiple picks during the explosion section of your dive. Lastly, let's talk about Dive versus Dive. This is all about playing split, taking individual duels and being proactive. If you're playing an aggressive composition that can't counter dive very well, like a Bull composition for example, then you want to take the fight as quickly as possible. You don't need the perfect setup, you don't need to take all these perfect angles before the fight. You want to act explosively and as quickly as possible. Alternatively, if you are playing a more sustained based dive composition, for example you have a Winston with an Anna as your flex support, then you often want to play slower, set up properly, get in position, and then play proactively once you have ultimates. You should discuss ahead of time what splits you're playing. Are you all diving the same target, or is part of your team going to peel and under what circumstances? It's generally a good rule of thumb to know what you're meant to be doing before you do anything. And that is it, that is all we've learned thus far. It doesn't seem like a lot when you condense it down so quickly. But again, if you haven't seen any of the individual videos that I've posted previously, I highly recommend watching the series in order. It'll explain everything much better. You need to be able to identify very quickly how you want to play your composition, no matter what enemy composition they throw at you. It's no good realising halfway through the match or at the end of the match that you want to play more aggressively. You need to take more high ground, I don't know. You need to know within the first couple of seconds of them exiting the spawn door. And because of this, it's really important that you get familiar with these matchups. You might want to watch this video a couple of times, or the previous videos a couple of times, just to get it stuck in that big head of yours. Anyways, the next video will be on chokes, so look forward to that. Have a great day, and if you have any questions, queries, or just want to take fun out of my accent, then chuck me a comment down below. But farewell for now, I will see you bright and happy folks in the next video. Bye!